we've given it 5 minutes, and I'm sure some people will join us as we go along. So my name's Jane Swan. I co-chair the Bond Partnership Approaches Learning Group with Lucy Morris at the British Red Cross. And today we have got Jan Bouwman from Oxfam, who is going to be presenting this problem, if you want to call it that, on partnership types that they would like to hear from all of us about in the form of a peer assist. So could I just quickly go around and ask people to introduce themselves, just so we've got an idea of who's on the call and to make it a little bit less anonymous. So Jan, would you like to start off by introducing yourself? Jan, could you hear me? I'm not sure if Jan's having technical problems, so I'm just going to move to the next person on the list. Ian, can you hear me? I think you...
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes, that's fine.
Great. I'll try. Yeah. There we are. Right. Sorry, I think that might have been Jan trying to join.
All right, well, why don't you just go ahead and Jan can go next.
Oh, okay. So my name's Ian. I'm support to the program quality team, which is the team that Jan's a part of here in Oxfam. I'm going to be taking notes basically, and yes, supporting Jan if he needs it.
That's great, thank you, Ian. Jan, are you there with us?
Yeah, I had an issue, my connection.
Okay. Could you hear what I was just asking you to introduce yourself? I may have to present for Jan at this rate. I think he's having some technical issues. We've got Aditi. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks, Jane. This is Aditi Chandak, and I'm the Learning and Knowledge Advisor from WaterAid. And we work as part of the Program Support Unit in International Programs Department at WaterAid.
That's great. Thank you, Aditi. Louisa, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Louisa Gosling. I work in the same team as Aditi in the program quality team, and I work on partnerships, developing tools and training and frameworks, and also sort of trying to support countries to develop partnership strategies that support their programmatic strategies.
Great. Lucy?
Hi everyone, my name is Lucy Morris and I work at the British Red Cross and I work as a National Society Development and Partnership Advisor and one of the co-chairs for this group.
Thanks Lucy. And Rob?
Yeah, good afternoon everyone, Rob Fuller. My job title here at WaterAid is Global Water Sector Advisor, but I sit within our Strategic Partnerships team, and my role is primarily about establishing a variety of partnerships, both fundraising and non-financial, and also supporting our institutional funding team around consortia development and consortia-led bids.
That's great, thank you Rob. Jan, have we managed to get you back?
Yes. Hold on, because
I now have the computer and my phone on. Hold on. Try to close it. Can you hear me?
Yes, it's a bit echoey, but go ahead.
Well,
I don't know
what. Hold on.
Mute your computer or your phone.
Yeah,
one of them has to be muted.
Yes.
I don't want to.
Hello?
Yeah, we're still here.
Okay, you hear me now?
Yes, that's better.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, it took me a while to figure out how to do this. So yeah, sorry about that. But yeah, my name is Jan Bouwman, and I'm the partnership advisor for Oxfam Great Britain. I'm working with Jo, and we're now looking at, like stretching our thinking about our partnership work, and really would like to try to, have a discussion today with you guys to help us on our way.
Great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, which I've got a presentation from Jan, and he's going to take us through that. And what we're going to do is we're going to stop as we go through the presentation and ask for some feedback on the various topics for discussion. So it won't be a one whole presentation and then conversation. We're going to mix up the presentation, as it were, with the discussion. So there'll hopefully be plenty of time for everyone to contribute. And then at the end of the conversation, what I'd like to do is just take a little bit of time, 15-20 minutes, for everyone to have a brief think about what they've heard and feedback some final thoughts, whether they're related to the presentation or more generally to this topic of different types of partnership. And then hopefully what we can then do is Jan and Jo can take away what they've heard today. We've got someone taking some minutes, Ian's taking minutes, and hopefully this will be the start of a conversation, and Jan and Jo might come back to some of us to follow up on what's been said. So hoping for this to be really interactive. Please feel free to talk or say if you've got something. You don't need to wait until we get to the end of the presentation. So over to you, Jan, and let me just double check that I have shared this. Yeah, here we go. So I hope that everyone can see that. Just let me know via the message function if you can't see the screen. Over to you, Jan.
Yeah, so I cannot see what you see because I'm doing it through my phone because my internet connection is really not good enough. But
okay.
I know I have the same document you have, so I'll just go through that. But if there are questions and comments and things like that, people typing, I won't be able to see that. But just make sure that you catch up on that. And I want to repeat what you just said. Really, this wants to be a discussion. We don't want to come in presenting what we have or not. I'll give a couple of examples. I'll talk a little bit about the challenges that we face. And then we would really like to have an open discussion with you guys on what do you use for types of relationships, types of partnerships, how do you categorize your partnerships, and how does that influence the different systems that you have, and how does that affect your partnerships? So really, I don't want to be the one talking all the time. It really is for us to share ideas, bounce ideas off each other, and then see how far we can go. I don't know if you all had time to read the problem statement that we sent out a week or so ago. Did anybody read that or not at all?
Yes, I did, Jan. Thank you.
I did too.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, then what I want to do is just follow the same structure a little bit, just to keep the conversation a bit guided. And as you can see here on the first slide, I want to give a little bit of an introduction to the problem based on that shared problem statement that we sent out, but like give you a little bit more concrete examples and things like that so that we can shape the conversation around those maybe. And then I want to go into, okay, let's break up a little bit this problem in different aspects. So first, maybe have a bit of a discussion on partnership definitions. So what makes a partnership, and in that definition, are there already elements that help us categorize in a certain way? Then I would like to look at, okay, what are different methodologies for categorization, and which ones are the ones that you find useful, not useful, why, what are advantages, disadvantages, to see a little bit what is out there, what different organizations use. Then I would like to look at systems and processes based on that categorization. So how does that inform your systems and processes? And then why not look at partners themselves? After that, just to have a quick look at, okay, but how do partners feel about this categorization? Have they been involved in setting up these categorization and things like that? And then maybe if we have time, a bit of discussion on what our donors think about this and how we can influence them using these kind of categorizations and definitions. And then, as Jane already said, we can then have some key reflections on what we've heard and what we want to take forward or not. Does that sound okay?
That's great.
Okay. So on the next slide, the introduction on the problem statement. So just to give you a very quick overview of how we came to organize this session and this discussion, it's like, okay, we as Oxfam, we really want to remain relevant in a very fast-changing world. So we made, as you might be aware, some significant changes to our operating model, now coming under Oxfam International and the different affiliates and things like that. I'm not going into that, but just to let you know that, you know, we are really changing significantly our operating model, which has a big impact on how we do our work in country offices. At the same time, we'd like to shift our focus from service delivery to more influencing, convening, and brokering roles, because that's where we feel that our added value is. So those are the two main changes that we're going through at the moment. And we feel that partnering is even more crucial than it has been in the past for us. We do have a current partnership policy, we have systems, we have tools in place. Each of our affiliates has slightly different systems and tools in place, which complicates it a little bit more, but we have a common Oxfam International Partnership Policy with a definition, with principles that we uphold, but we are now feeling that they do not always lead to those empowering relationships that we envision. And secondly, they're not sophisticated enough to cater for all the new types of partners and new types of relationships that we're thinking about and talking about in that new vision and that fast-changing context. So the idea was to stretch our thinking a little bit and look and relook and review our partnership model. And we think that it would be a good starting point to work on, okay, what do we define as partnership? Like, what does it really mean? What makes it different? What kind of relationships do we have? And from those types of relationships and those definitions, can we then see if we can make our processes and systems more adapted to fit for and fit for the future? So basically, that is the idea. Now, on the next slide, I'm just going to talk you through a couple of our programs and issues that have come up in the past couple of months, really. Just to give you a bit of a flavor of what are the kind of issues that we face and what are the kind of the challenges that we have and why this idea of working on a definition and types of partnerships has become one of our key entry points. So to start with, in Myanmar, we're now so the main problem there was that the team wanted to work with non-recognized movements and organizations that work in areas where the government does not have the legitimacy of the local population and organizations, and they don't want to be recognized. But in our systems, we often request that that organizations are recognized, that they have a registration number by the authorities, but they don't want to do that. But to do our work in the humanitarian setting, we need to work with those partners because they are the only ones who have the legitimacy and access in those areas. So that puts us into a difficult situation. Are we able to do that or are we not? And the current way of the way our systems are structured do not really allow us to do that. So we're now looking at what are the risks, how can we adapt our system to make this kind of work possible, or do we take a stand and say, no, we will not be able to do that for these and these and these reasons. Another example is Bangladesh. They work with academia for years and years, but they usually use them as consultants, and the contracts are consultancy contracts for specific pieces of work, to specific research. Last time I was there, I had a big discussion with some academia and the Bangladesh team, and they said, well, we are not consultants. We are partners. This goes way beyond just that piece of work that we're doing. We've been working for years and years on end. Can we not become partners? And the whole discussion there is then, okay, but like, what are the local laws? What does the government of Bangladesh allow or not allow? From a partnership perspective, academia can become a partner really easily. But if then the piece of work is a piece of research, does that still need to be a consultancy, yes or no? And then the whole issue that came up was about the VAT, because as a consultant, you have to pay the VAT tax. But as a partner, you might not have to, because we're exempt in somehow. So these kind of discussions of like, so when are we a partner and when are we not? And the Philippines, another example, has developed a strategic partnership model, really wanted to change the way they worked and really look forward to that vision that we have of being brokers and conveners. And so the strategic partnerships are more important to them. So they want long-term, focus on co-creation, capacity strengthening, but now they have a bit of trouble sometimes because they also have a lot of ad hoc opportunities, just like quick wins, a quick opportunity of a project here or some influencing there, and they don't know how to fit that in that more global strategic model. So there's choices to be made. They also set up a whole new business model and talk about partnership relationship managers rather than program managers. And, you know, like they are working on that tension between empowerment of local partners and really give them, you know, the freedom and the opportunity and the possibility to be the organization they want to be. And at the same time, the compliance of still our, you know, like the programs that we have and the accountability that we have to our donors and beneficiaries. The West African region, they did research on strategic partnership, and they were convinced that they had certain partnerships that they could call strategic. But during the research, it became really clear, really quickly, that Oxfam and partners had completely different definitions on what strategic actually means. And I think we still, as an organization, do not have a very clear definition of what we would call strategic partnerships. And it's used very often, but nobody really understands what it entails. And I think it's important that we clear up these definitions that we use. The Zambia team, they're implementing their whole country strategy through networks. So they no longer want to create bilateral partnerships to do pieces of work, but they have created or are working with local networks, and they want to implement the program through these networks, which is a completely different way of working to which our systems are not really adapted yet. In Kenya, this was an interesting problem at a certain point because they have a new vision, a new country strategy. They want to look at new and different ways of partnering and working with organizations, and we received a request for a waiver to not apply any of the partnership processes that we have in place because they felt that they were not adapted to the type of partnerships they envisioned in their country program, which put us like, well, we feel that you need to adapt certain tools if they're not adapted to your specific context, but you have to go through these processes because that's just how partnerships are built up and so on. So we're still in discussion with them to see how we can best adapt our tools to make them work for them and our systems. In LAC, there's great support to movements. They're also becoming Southern affiliates, changing completely their perspective from we are an international organization to we're becoming a local civil society organization. So the way they partner, the way they work, the way they profile themselves has become completely different. So there's a lot of learning to do there. Gracie works a lot with multi-stakeholder initiatives. It's a multi-country program in Southeast Asia. And then the question is, are we part of that multi-stakeholder initiative? Are we just influencing them? Are we supporting them from the outside to make them strong? So what is our role in each of these activities? Then a couple of other projects which are coming up now, which are really interesting from the partnership perspective, are the Enterprise Development Program, in which we try to help local agricultural firms and enterprises to become stronger. So we provide loan guarantees as well as grants to like build their capacity so they can become like better producers and at the same time, you know, look at gendered approaches and things like that. But these are enterprises, and we are providing loans and grants, but our systems do not have that category. Our information system doesn't have a category different than that, than partners. So we put them in the partner category, but they're quite different from other partners that we have. So it creates a little bit of black complications. The same goes for the Unilever project that we have. We have a joint fund to simulate and to support the Unilever supply chain or enterprises to improve their gendered and sustainable approaches and things like that. But there as well, we can only put them in the system as partners, but they're really not. The selection procedures are completely different. The focus is completely different from our more classical or traditional partnerships and stuff, but our systems are not yet adapted to that. Had a very interesting discussion with our WASH team yesterday on market-based WASH approaches. And there as well, there's a lot of opportunity to work with local as well as international enterprises to really see how we can make that work. But the skill set to actually set up these partnerships with completely different organizations than ours puts our staff in difficult positions. And we're now looking at how can we build capacity to actually, make this happen. How can we learn from each other to actually make sure that we do that. But all of these new kind of elements, the new unusual suspects, the movements, that's where we really see that change is going to happen. And we really want to support that, and we really want to jump on that train, but our systems are still lagging behind. And that's why we feel that we want to have this discussion with you guys to see how you are looking at all of this, and if your systems are better, if you have clearer definitions, and maybe typologies of partnerships that we can learn from. So yeah, that's a bit the problem statement. That's a bit the idea of some examples of things that we're working on and the challenges that we face. And now I'll give you a little bit of time if you want to react immediately, but I would then like to go and continue to have that discussion on the partnership definition on a more global in a more general way. But if you have any comments on the problem statement so far, then please do.
Thanks, Jan. Anyone got any comments or questions at this point?
Hi Jan, it's Lucy here. I just had one question, which was you were referring to how I guess some of these ways of working aren't fitting with your existing systems and procedures, and I wasn't sure in terms of how you define partnership at the moment. I know within the earlier version of the presentation you had the partnership definition, I think it was in there, and the principles, but do you have, is there anything else that Oxfam has already that tries to define different types of partnerships, or is that one kind of overarching definition that you have at the moment?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. That definition that I shared and those principles are the definitions that we have at the moment. And for those who don't remember, I can quickly say it out loud. Let me see. So we define Oxfam, and this is Oxfam International, so it's not an Oxfam GB thing, and it's going to be quite complicated for us to change these definitions and these principles because we need to get the whole confederation to agree on these. But the definition that we currently use is mutually empowering relationships, cognizant of power imbalances that are focused on impact, mutual growth, organizational development, and institutional strengthening. And then the 6 principles that we have are shared vision and values, complementarity of purpose and value add, autonomy and independence, transparency and mutual accountability, clarity on roles and responsibility, and commitment to joint learning. Now, this definition and these principles, that's the overarching one. And as we will discuss a little bit later, that many country offices try to do different things, try to define it a little bit further and things like that. But it's not it's like an internal way of doing, and we don't have a guidance on this of okay, we need to have more specific definitions, more criteria, more different types. And that's what we would like to do now, to really try to see if we, from the experiences from all our country offices, now can extract 3 or 4 categories or typologies of relationships that we can then move forward, and that might affect how we then define partnerships.
Thanks, Jan. That's really helpful.
Yeah, and a quick question from me. I'm just working on a partner guidance paper with my colleague Joe Hack, who's our partnership advisor, and we so it's kind of a bit of a guided tour of our partners of what we expect of them and what they should expect of us. And we've got a section on the partnership typologies, and we were sitting this morning actually and asking ourselves why do we need to know this, and do our partners need to know this? So I'm wondering, how useful is it actually? To what purpose are we actually doing this? Is it because we like to categorize things, or is it going to actually help us develop processes and focus the different types of interventions we do with different types of partners? And so I'm sort of slightly playing devil's advocate here, but we were struggling with how we would present that to partners as to why we do it. You know, how would we, in a rational way, say you're a strategic partner, you're a project partner, you're a solidarity partner. What does that mean for partners, and would they understand why we were doing that?
Yeah, so those are the kind of questions that I would like to ask to the group, right? Let's have that discussion. And so I think I asked those questions in my problem statement that I send out. But I wanted to start with the definition first, and if we can then go back to the typologies and the categories that you use or might find useful. And in that second section, I actually ask, so is this useful? Why do we do it? Like, what are the advantages and the disadvantages? And have you like thought about that? And is it useful? Can we put it in boxes? Can we categorize it? And should it be a very broad categorization? And what I like about the Oxfam systems is that they're quite broad and very general, leaving the country offices a lot of liberty to actually interpret it themselves, to make adaptations within those broad guidelines. But we feel that a lot of country teams seem to struggle with that. So now we want to give them a little bit more of, you know, like this could be helpful for you, but is it then useful to make it stringent? And how strict do you make it? And how well defined do you make it? Because there's so many options. There's so many different types of relationships, different types of partners, different types of collaborations. It's probably very hard to put everything in a box, but we're just looking at some broad categories that might make it useful. But I think, like, if we can discuss this question and we hold it for the next, for the second part after the partnership definition, then we can have that discussion a little bit closer and see if we can, as a group, find an answer to your question.
Sorry, I have a quick comment.
Yeah, go ahead, Louisa.
Yeah, sorry, and I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to leave a bit early, so that's why I want to get in now. But we had the same sort of discussion in WaterAid, and we've kind of opted to keep, rather than try and develop lots of different categories for different kind of partnership, to say that we've just got a kind of a formal partnerships, broader collaboration, consortia, and contracts, you know, and that and then the different sorts of organisations we work with, and then to try and so be more flexible, because I think a bit like you said, having this idea of having lots of different categories, what about the one that you miss out, you know? But anyway, let's carry on with the rest of your presentation. But I just wanted to kind of respond to that, and I've been sort of, there's been a bit of pressure to sort of develop more categories. So in a way, I'm quite pleased to hear that it's not necessarily that helpful. But let's carry on with your presentation.
Yeah, so like these questions will come up a little bit later, and I think it's a fair point to say. It's like, is it and we're still at that point. We have kind of the feeling that it would be very useful for us to have 2 or 3, but very broad kind of categories. But at the same time, we're still struggling with that question: will that be useful, and how will partners see that? How will that affect how we do our work, and how will it be useful in a country team where there's such a wide variety? So yeah, so let's discuss that a little bit later on, if that's okay.
Great. Do you want to move to the next part, Jan, on your presentation?
Yeah. So yeah, so because when I thought about all this, I thought like it would also be good to look at the partnership definition even before we look at the categories. And even there, we already have that dichotomy or the two extremes on the partnership continuum, and we talk on one side, and these are words that Oxfam uses, like the continuum between like the extremes of transactional relationships or tactical ad hoc short-term output-driven relationships versus the transformational or more strategic long-term impact-driven ones. And now I was just wondering about the term partnership. You know, like when do we use partnership? And we seem to use it very often for all the kinds of relationships that we have. We just call everybody a partner and everybody a partnership. And I was just want to see what other people think of that. Is that actually the case? And if partnership is a very specific thing, if you look at our definition, we call it mutual empowering relationships with a focus on impact, with a focus on institutional strengthening, then maybe half of the relationships that we have are actually not partnerships. But we don't have another secondary definition to actually identify those. So, and to not have me talking, I was just going to ask a quick question to you. It's like I made a quick spectrum there, and I wanted to ask you where on the spectrum would you speak of a partnership? Like, would you put it at number 1, number 2, number 3, or only number 5 are partnerships for you, more towards the transformational, strategic, long-term impact-driven kind of relationships? And then we can have that quick discussion on that before moving on to like what kind of categories or things we would like to discuss. Is that clear? So basically, where, like, from what number onwards would you talk about a partnership, and do you then have other categories for what comes before that number?
Hi, Jan, this is Lucy. I guess I struggle a bit with the numbering system, but I'm happy to talk about the experience within British Red Cross recently, because I think until very recently we didn't differentiate between different kinds of relationships. We called all of the working relationships partners. And I think we assumed that we had a fewer number of working relationships than we actually do. So what we've done quite recently is to come up with a definition now of partnership for the first time, and also to come up with different kind of what definitions of what is a partnership, but also what isn't a partnership, what is a more transactional relationship. So it's still very early days, and it's still work in progress, because I think although we've come up now with 4 different kind of relationship types, and what we're now trying to do is to map within the organization against these types and to see, do all of the existing relationships fit in? And against these types, also looking at the funding modality, so seeing that as different. So it's work in progress, but I'd say that, I guess going back to your question about where in the spectrum would you speak of partnership, then the partnerships within BRC we're looking at probably, sort of 4 or 5 that they would be the transformational type of relationships that are more strategic, but still some focusing on kind of on program level, so not only strategic and kind of high level relationships, but also programmatic relationships, but where there is that genuine give and take.
Thanks, Lucy.
Yeah. Does anybody else?
Go, carry on.
Sorry.
Yeah, sure. I would say that I think for us, I would say that at the very extreme end of the transactional, we'd call that a contract. And, that's where you've got a specific service that's being delivered. But then we've kept the term, I don't know whether this is right or wrong at all, but the term partnership to kind of cover in a way the rest. So I'd say sort of from 2 upwards, but kept the definition of partnership very broad. And then when there's no real funding from WaterAid to the partner, then that's more of a kind of a collaboration when it's a bit looser. So a formal partnership has a kind of a formal partnership sort of document with specific objectives and so on. But collaboration can be in anything that's a kind of looser than that, maybe an MOU and so on. So where we're not necessarily transacting funds. So I think the difficulty of the trouble is that in our country programs, there's a sort of very strong sort of idea of partners, which are some of which I would say are contracts. Basically, they're very transactional and very much, you know, we will give you money, you will do this for us. So I think trying to kind of just differentiate between when that's just a contract and when it's more of a yes, we'll do it for you, but there's also a more strategic element to the relationship in terms of capacity or joint influencing or whatever, then it becomes a partnership. But I think trying to kind of stop, you know, it's very difficult to change these things at country programs, so trying to sort of broaden it rather than to kind of shift what it means is what we're trying to do.
Sorry, this is Rob here from WaterAid as well. I think I'd add to what Louisa said as well is that what we probably don't do well enough is distinguish between delivery partners, as Louisa's just described, so in-country partners, and funding, donating collaborative partners who are more likely based in the UK or elsewhere within our federation. And so again, the not very helpful answer is partnership. It depends who you're asking the organisation as to what they define a partner as. And I think there's also an aspect of time in it as well. So we have a number of, on the funding side of things, very transactional partnerships, but they've been going 30 plus years. So we would certainly call them partners, albeit all they do is give us a slug of money each year and get some reporting back. So it's unhelpfully, I think, from what you're asking, is we don't necessarily have a clear definition or picture either.
I think for CAFOD, I think the continuum is quite interesting, because what we do is we have a sort of a box, as it were, with sort of the level of transaction going up one side and the level of transformation going along the bottom, and we sort of map them as if on a scatter graph. So, you know, it might be quite transactional in one sense, or it might be that, you know, like with the academia or something, but there's still an element of that transformational strategic work that's also being carried out. So we're not mapping them against one straight line, but along a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. So that gives you a little bit of a more nuanced idea of the way that you're working with partners.
Yeah, I like that. Thanks for all your contributions. I think, like, we're all in very similar positions, it seems, you know, like struggling with the question of, like, okay, we have this partnership definition, but is it clear enough? Is it not clear enough? And how do we do that? So, like, as Lucy was saying, like, have already 4 types, but then, you know, we need to map that out and see if this actually corresponds to the reality, and if it fits and if it's useful. Because if it's not, then, you know, the solution of WaterAid to have, like, okay, well, we call everything a partnership, we leave it quite broad, but it's workable and we all know what we're talking about, then that's fine. But I really like the reflection on, like, what does it mean for our country teams, right? Because now they come to me and they ask, oh, Jan, we need different ways of working with different new kinds of partners, and they can't even define it. It's like, so what would like to do? Like, what is it that you really need? And they can't really define all the activities. They have ideas in their head, but they don't really know how to take it forward. And you know, they're used to that more transactional kind of relationship that we have of, like, oh, we have a program, we co-design to a certain degree, or sometimes we co-create, but often we don't, or we take a strong lead in that, and then we just ask the partners to implement the project, and you have that power dynamics that you can then, you know, like, work around with, you know, like the way you set up your accountability systems and things like that. And different countries do that in different ways, but it's a really strong culture of, you know, we have that transactional kind of relationship. We're just, you know, like, hiring local organizations and strengthening them. And so we're helping them, and we have to support them, we monitor them, we build their capacity and things like that. that's not what partnership is to us, because it's that mutually empowering, like the joint learning and things like that. And that element in our culture is not there yet. And so what we would like to do and try to do is, like, can we then, and would this categorization of the different types of relationships that we've been talking about, would that help in instilling that culture more easily?
Yeah, and Rob Fuller again. Can I ask a quick question? Because you mentioned 7 times, and I think it's in your principles. But what do you mean by an empowering partnership, and how do you go about measuring that?
Yeah, so I think that's where the issues are. We have that definition, but I don't think that we actually measure against it. We don't have a system in place, like a real monitoring of. So, like, we stimulate our country teams to monitor the relationship, to review the partnership, but we don't have a set of indicators that would say, like, this is actually a partnership, because these are the indicators that we actually have. So I think that might be a way forward as well. Like, when you identify certain levels of engagement, certain levels of partnership, that you make clear indicators on that. It's like, if you want an empowering relationship that is, like what we really feel is a partnership, then these 4 or 5 criteria need to be in place. If that's not the case, then the relationship is not that. So we don't really do that, and that is a little bit the problem. Our partnership definition is quite broad, and it's focuses on institutional strengthening, but then our capacity building is very often just linked to project and program implementation, rather than organizational development on a longer term scale, or something that is not linked to our programs. So it's then interpretation of different country teams of as you say, it just depends on who you talk to see what they feel is an empowering relationship. And as I mentioned in the West African example, what our staff felt as empowering relationships was not at all felt the same way by the local partners. So even having that discussion on what do we mean with each of our partners, what this relationship is, and how we define it, that would be a good exercise. Rather than having just one definition that is just out there and we just share our partnership policy with our partners, we try to stimulate our teams to actually have a conversation with the partner and define this partnership yourselves, like establish what you mean by it. And in some of our country strategies, the Timor-Leste one and the Myanmar one, for example, they actually build on these principles and say, these are the OI principles, but for our partnerships, we also add these 3 or 4 other elements that for us in our culture and context are important. And I hope that they have been established in discussion with partners. But I think it's a really good point, and I think that's why a bit of the difficulty is, because we have a definition. It's a broad definition. It's a beautiful definition, but how many of our partnerships actually live up to that? And if we don't measure it, if we don't see it, but the Keystone survey that we did in 2014 shows really clearly that we're not there at all.
Yeah, and this is Lucy, and I just wanted to share some reflections on I guess, conversations with Louisa at WaterAid and one of her colleagues in Nigeria, because I had the chance to find out a bit more about how WaterAid was working in partnership, but also kind of helping staff to understand different partnership approaches and helping them to work together with their partners in country. And I was just really struck when I visited Nigeria and had the chance to talk to WaterAid staff there, how they said that, I guess, through the training which Louisa had been supporting with, that it had basically changed the language. It had given them a common language through which to talk about partnership with their colleagues. So the person said to me, it used to feel like I was speaking Latin, and now it feels like we're speaking the same language. So I think, yes, it's about systems and processes, but as much it's about building the awareness and the common language around partnership.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that's, like, each relationship is a little bit different, and everybody comes with certain elements, and very often we present these are our partnership principles, this is what we mean by partnership. But if you then read that policy and and you then see what we actually do when we implement the project together, then very often our partners say, but that is not what you say in your policy. And they just accept it. But like, it would be really good if we have that conversation a bit more often to really see, okay, but what does this mean? At what level of partnership are you? And this goes back to the question raised earlier, like, what do partners want? Like, how do they experience that if we put them in certain boxes and have different levels of partnership? Would they be happy with the clarity that now they don't have to expect that mutually empowering relationship with institutional strengthening and organizational development and long-term 5-year contracts or whatever? Or are they kind of sad that they not fit in the high-level kind of partnerships that we envision, but it's more like a transactional one? And I think that clarity with the partner is important. So it's not about us in headquarters figuring out, oh, this is the perfect system or this is the perfect categorization. It's just helping the country teams being able to have that discussion with the local partners and create that common language about their partnership. So I think, yeah, you made a good point.
I think the difficulty with all of this is like, because the terms are understood so differently in different places. And Lucy, it's very nice that you had that conversation in Nigeria, and I think the training is kind of like getting people to shift, but it's really starting from sort of first principles about sort of roles and responsibilities and what people expect from each other, and the kind of relationship, and who gives what to whom, and what the different interests and incentives are from the different sides. And I mean, we've developed this with the partnerships in practice thing, and I think that's quite good, because I think as soon as you introduce terms like strategic partnership or this or whatever, there's a huge amount of sort of translation that goes on between sort of different cultural settings, and one of the big reasons why it's so difficult to shift from the kind of old forms of partnership is because the incentives for individuals to have that kind of donor-client relationship is incredibly high. It's very high in terms of who has power over who, and then kind of also what happens if things go wrong. You can sort of blame the partner or this, that, or the other, and so while it's problematic for people, it's also kind of familiar, and there are big power relations in there. And as you move to a more empowering kind of relationship, then that means that the WaterAid or the Oxfam staff have to kind of give up some of the power in the relationship, step back and be more facilitators. And the trouble is that it's not just the systems, but the kind of the whole hierarchy has built up over years and years to promote this more sort of client patronage sort of system. So I think that's why it really is about, I think having clearer definitions is good for some people who like definitions, but a lot of people don't, or will read a definition and understand something quite different when they read it. That's my thought.
Yeah, that makes, like, I agree with that, and that's the question of the usefulness of categorization, and like, should we really break our heads on this? But I think it is important to give some guidance, and the guidance that and what I'm struggling with is the guidance that we have, and in the talk that we have about, like, wow, partnership, and it's mutually empowering, and this is our vision, but that we just don't do it, and that discourse and that gap in the discourse and what we actually do is, to me, is troubling. And then, like, should we then lower our standards? Should we then lower or invest more to do it differently? Or it's like, so what do we then need to do? And then probably working on some clearer definitions is probably an easier step to start with, I think.
Thanks, Jan. Did anyone else have any more questions at this point, or Can we move on to the next part of the presentation conversation? No?
No other questions? No, not from this side.
All right.
Great. All right, Jan, would you like to carry on?
Yeah, sure. So I put in some follow-up questions, but we discussed that, you know, do we abuse the word partnerships? Are there other options for terminology? So we heard like collaboration, cooperation, aligned service delivery. So like, you know, like there's some clear options that you have to talk about that. So I just put a couple of questions there, but like we can move on. And what I wanted to do now is just looking at some ways of categorizing partnership. And I sent this table out in my problem statement. And I just wanted to hear a little bit. We've already talked a little bit about some of these, but I just wanted to give you time to have a look at it. And then on the next slide, I just asked a couple of questions. So do you use any of these categories, or which categorizations do you find most useful and why? And how would they link to our discussion on the partnership definition that we just had? And then underneath that, I also ask about, is that categorization useful or not? We already started discussing it, but we could now answer that question that Jane made at the beginning. So what are the advantages and disadvantages? Is this useful or not? And I just gave a couple of examples here of types of how you could organize and categorize partnership. But I just want to give you a minute or just like give you the floor to say like, hey, yeah, that's the one we use and we find that very useful. And I just picked these up in different documents and stuff like that. So yeah, over to you to let me know what you think.
Do you just want to take a minute to have a look at that, because there's quite a bit of information there, and then if you've got questions or ideas, then just pitch in.
Hi, Jan, it's Lucy here. I've had a look through. I guess the ones that we're at the Red Cross that we're working with don't fit neatly into these categories. So I think on the one hand, we're looking at a funding modality, so that would kind of come up against the financial one. But at the same time, I guess the 4 different ways of working we've outlined. So one was what we're defining as partnerships. So one is a program partnership, which is focusing at program level, but also with potential for capacity building at program level. And then the other is the institutional partnership, which is kind of that higher level relationship and the much more kind of mutual joint strategizing. And then 2 kinds of relationships. So one is a transactional relationship, so that could be, you know, kind of contract delivery, service delivery, and the other is a peer relationship, which is more about sharing information and knowledge. Recognizing that all members of the federation are peers in a way. So it fits a little bit under financial if you were considering peer as non-funding, and I guess it links partially to, let's have a look, to scope, but it's kind of somewhere in between those. I think where I'm starting to feel because again it's very early days, so we're just now mapping against these different categories. I think what's interesting is that as we start to map, actually a lot of our partnerships are coming out as being institutional partnerships, and I guess the question then is, it allows us to then say, you know, are these genuinely institutional partnerships? And if there is an expectation of engagement on the UK side with the British Red Cross UK staff and the Secretary General here, is that feasible, actually, that level of relationship with so many different organisations? And also, do we have the level of funding to support investment at that level around organisational development or not? And in terms of monitoring that, so I think that's for me where the use is starting to come through.
I think for us, we went through a partnership review process in 2012 when we formally drew up our partnership policy. And so we have 3 types of partnership, which are strategic partnerships, project partnerships, and solidarity partnerships. And so that's quite broad. And one of the reasons we started doing this at all was actually for the strategic partnerships, it was looking at things like accountability and all those sorts of things, and kind of piloting some of these processes that we were going through with CHS and that kind of thing with a group of partners. And that's then gradually become embedded in our strategic partnerships, and now ones that inform our strategy. And so there's a bit of that, there's that level of mutual kind of engagement that when we look at our strategic direction, we ask those strategic partnerships to comment, and we do the same for them. A lot of the things that you've talked about here are things that we think about, but don't necessarily go into that kind of formal categorization. So things like the geographical level, we work a lot with Caritas organizations, so they can operate at local, national, regional levels. We don't look at number of partners or anything like that, or the level of formality. Types of agreement are kind of a subset of the categorization. So we have partnership agreements with our strategic partners. MOUs we tend to have more with sister organizations, so that tends to be more northern agencies. Capacity development, again, that tends to be, when it's standalone, tends to be with strategic partners. The level of engagement, that's quite interesting. We have that as a separate part of our policy, which is the phases of partnership. So are we initiating a partnership? Are we maintaining it? Are we transitioning to something else? Are we exiting? That sort of thing. So that fits, it doesn't quite fit into the same thing, but that's how we do it. It's quite broad, and then a lot of the other things come as subsets of that. So it might be the funding modality or the agreement or the type of work that we're doing, which then fits under the types of partnership.
Anybody else?
I like the way that you've broken. I thought these are practical. I like the sort of practicality that you've got in your organising principles, and I think I would see them as like things that are useful to encourage people to be specific about what they want, rather than for the purpose of categorising. But these are the types of things they need to think about when they are developing their agreements. But I think these are practical categories.
Yeah, I just pulled them together, and I tried to make it like very different stuff. And I understand the subsets. There might be one that is particularly useful for a certain way of looking at partnerships, and the others become subsets of it. But yeah, in effect, and especially thinking about the systems, the time of engagement, for example, if you have a new partnership or a mature partnership that you have a long term, or it's something do you approach those differently? Are your systems then different? The process that you go through might be more swift. You might have different activities. You might not want to do like a full assessment of risk or things like that. So yeah, I totally agree that these are just like a full list of like possibilities, and not even a full list. There might be many others. But yeah, I think all of these elements are part of the kind of partnerships that we have, and we should think about and be clear about them all with our partners and what we would like to achieve.
Any other comments?
No, I think I was just going to say I found it a really interesting way to look at partnerships in different ways. So yeah, thanks for pulling together the table. It is useful.
Yeah, Rob.
Yeah. So and I don't know if is Yo in Jane, is Yo there?
She, for some reason, hasn't been able to join, but I've just resent her the details, so I'm hoping she's going to join us very soon.
Oh, okay. No, because she was quite like when she saw this, and then she said, no, but what we are looking for in Oxfam, you know, it's more of types of relationships, like the number 5 kind of category, but she wasn't really happy with how they were formulated more in like in like a funding modality or things like that. So she's still looking at something different. And the ideas of that we're playing with is like the strategic partner, the implementing partner, and then consortium or like networks and things like that. But we haven't really found out which one it is yet, and we're still looking at what would be our best way. But we want to focus on the relationship, and then types of partners is important as well, because you would treat them differently. You would have different approaches to each, but then maybe we can find, and the idea is to find 3 or 4 categories. And like the one that Lucy mentioned, yeah, so I think it's going to be something along those lines of how they fit in. But I also wanted to share something else, because I looked at some of the strategies and looking at how our country teams look at this. And I was like seeing, like, do they have categorizations and how do they do it? And I found that they do it quite differently. For example, in more or less in their partnership strategy, they actually talk about first level partners, second level partners, service provision, and then counterpart partnerships. And then they describe what a first level partner is, but they don't use terminology like strategic or implementing or things like that. But the first level partnership would be, and then they look at length of the relationship. So that's a 3 to 5 year kind of relationship. The capacity and the criteria for the organization, like they have to have strong capacity and be able to lead their own project, to write their own project proposal, and things like that. So the approach to design is that there's joint design, or the partner leads the design, and the nature of the relationship can be formal, strategic. There's like institutional capacity strengthening, and so that's the first level partnership. The second level is then 3 to 5 years, but it's, like the capacity of the partner is a bit less strong. So they need more support and more monitoring from our side. So the design process is more joint and really supportive of, like we co-create, while the first level partnerships are more, even more independent, as you wish. And then they jump straight into service provision and counterpart partnerships, which are the non-formalized or non-formal kind of non-registered kind of community-based organizations they might work with. And I thought that, like, okay, they just call it differently. They look at it practically from their point of view. And another interesting one is the Myanmar, and they call them, I'm not going to talk about all the characteristics of each one, but I thought it's quite telling that their categorization is so different. So they have 6 categories. The first one is strong and supported partners. The second one is partners with strong local presence, but with less organizational capacity. The third one is a young, enthusiastic civil society organization. 4th is established networks. 5 is collaborative and professional institutions, academia, research, and the like. And then the 6th category is unusual suspects, the less obvious partners. So they look at it completely differently, but then mixing certain things. Like from our classical kind of partnership, they look at the capacity of the partner, and this links into what was previously said on the power relationship, I think. So some of these organizations have the power to stand up to us, right? So you cannot approach them in that contract and transactional kind of way, because they don't need us for survival or for capacity strengthening or for funding, because they're strong enough and they can stand on their own legs, and that relationship that we have with them is completely different. And that's the focus that the country teams seem to be putting on on their classification, and then they mix it up with different types of partners or different types of organization. But I thought that was quite interesting to see that when we talk about strategic partnership and quite general kind of broad kind of session, they actually look at the practicality for them in their country office. And I just wanted to share that.
Thanks for that, Jan. We've got Yo now with us as well, so welcome, Yo.
Thank you so much. Hi, guys.
Yeah, Yo, we're just talking about like the types and the categorization of partnership that we're thinking about and things like that. Maybe you want to share your ideas of what you look at as like, because you focused a lot on like types of relationships, right? Rather than any of the other categories that I pulled together. Do you want to share a little bit what your thoughts are? Or?
I think I'd rather listen a bit more first. I'm not quite sure where we are in the conversation, but I'll make sure I add mine. Sorry, I didn't get any join-in details, my fault. But I'll add it further on down the line, quite happy.
Okay. All right, then the next question.
This is Lucy.
Yeah, sorry.
Go on, Lucy.
I just wanted to respond to the point you made earlier, which I think is really interesting about how when you take the time to ask the country teams that actually they're doing a lot already and seeing things in certain ways already, and I think that was what we didn't have time to do internally or didn't make time to do internally. So yeah, it's prompted a question for me to go and to double check what were people doing in the first place.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because you mentioned that you created the categories a little bit, and now you go back to see if the relationships that you actually have would fit in those categories. So I guess that it's never going to be a closed system that is never going to be revised, or that not everything is going to fit. But I think it's really important to look at like what would be useful for our country teams, and how can we reflect what is actually happening on the ground in the categories that we have. And yeah, I think that is really important, because otherwise it just becomes another add-on to the partnership principles that we share with partners, but it's not really understood, it's not lived, it's not felt, and that's where that culture change starts. Of like, hey, yeah, I can do this relationship differently. And we had a session just now with some program managers in the Middle East. And they were actually talking about, and they were asking, so how much liberty do we have to adapt the tools and to adapt the systems? Because, we feel that sometimes it doesn't fit, but we're not sure, we're not confident to what extent we can actually, like categorize the way we see it and then adapt it to that. And I felt that was a very strong message to us. To really listen to what their needs are and how we can support that it works for them, and that might be that we cannot figure out one big categorization for the whole organization, but then just leave enough space, for everyone to interpret it to the context, but just really emphasizing that it's about that conversation with the partners that they actually create relationships with, to really make that clear what it means to them.
Yeah, and I think it also goes back to, I guess, issues of kind of who initiates the conversation, or who's driving the conversation about, for example, partnership types, and also kind of what time is available within which to decide, because all of those things influence the process too. But if there hasn't been the time, then it is important to go back and double check.
Yeah. Well, if that's all around the categorization, I think we could come back to the question now that Jane asked in the beginning, and we might have already touched upon it, but we might just want to close that conversation, and that's the one there. Is categorization useful? Why should we do it? And so, what are some of the advantages, or what are some of the disadvantages that you see? Because I don't know if after this call, together with you, we're going to sit down and say like, so are we going to take this project forward? Yes or no? So really, yeah, is it useful?
think one of the things that has been useful internally is, as I mentioned before, is it's starting to get us to think about resourcing. So I guess that's partly financial, and at what level, but also human resource on the UK side. So if these are kind of peer relationships that we're building and genuine conversations between peers, then do the peers on the UK side have enough time? How many relationships is it reasonable to expect colleagues on the UK side to engage in? So I think it's challenging us to think about resourcing, and I think it's also challenging us to think about due diligence and kind of how those partnerships would be monitored. And we haven't got there yet, because also it's work in progress. But in terms of due diligence, is it about kind of levels of funding that we're likely to be supporting or already supporting, or is it about, do we ask certain questions of certain kinds of partners and share information about ourselves, in return? So I think it's partly, for us, I think the value is partly around investment, partly around due diligence, and then partly around, well, how do we meaningfully monitor different types of relationships?
I think for us, as I was saying earlier, we've used our strategic partnerships as to sometimes pilot things, initiatives that we are doing, we have to do. So whether it's accountability or CHS things or IATU requirements or whatever it might be, we often take our strategic partnerships and try it with them. But another thing that we have had quite a lot of conversations about, and it's not something that we've resolved or particularly managed to move very far forward on, is that those types of funding. So we get a lot of unrestricted funding from our supporters, which we are able to use, in whichever part of our program that we want to. But we put quite a lot of conditions on funding that we give to our partners. So we've been piloting a few, not very many, areas where we've been giving partners what we've called strategic funding. So we've given them a small grant, and they've been able to use that for whatever they best think it could be used for. So, for them, if it's paying the electricity bill, then that's what they've used it for. And we've just asked them to report and show where that funding has made a difference, but we haven't earmarked it in any way as we would normally do. So we found it quite useful to differentiate different types of partnership for that purpose, to look at that kind of less restricted funding that we benefit from and try and pass that on to our partners. But as I say, we've only done that in a few areas, and it's still an ongoing conversation. Anyone else? I'd be very interested to hear what other people have to say about this. As I say, I'm grappling with this question as of this morning, in trying to think about how this is useful for when we share it with our partners, and how we explain it to our partners about why we're doing it.
Well, like I can share what like my experience. I was with Save the Children and IBIS in Sierra Leone before coming to Great Britain and my current position in Oxfam. And in Save the Children in Sierra Leone, we had 24 partners, and I believe IBIS had 20 in 3 different areas. And so they asked me to look at the partnership strategy, what we want to do, and things like that. And we're struggling as well, like, how are we going to consider these partners? And considering the level of engagement that we had, the capacities of the local partners, it was very hard to talk about like strategic partners with strong capacity that could actually move forward. So we tried to do all the co-creation and the joint planning and the monitoring of the relationships. But we soon felt that with 24 partners, it was just not doable. And the country director asked me, so what would your solution be? And I didn't want to use any words of like strategic or non-strategic, because I didn't feel that it was applicable to the different kinds of partnerships. And also thinking about partners, like how would they feel that they are strategic or non-strategic, or what does that mean? So we practically just set up a system of like, we want to we call certain partners of the pool of 24. Certain partners are priority partners and others are non-priority partners. And the priority partners just have a different, it's like there's going to be investment in the priority partners in the sense, because like I agree with Lucy that, you know, like the funding and the resourcing of 24 relationships at that high level of empowering relationship one was just not feasible. The team doesn't have time for that. The resources are just not there. And it was just not doable. So to really have a meaningful impact, we then created the priority, non-priority partners. And the difference was that in the priority partners, which we identified through a whole system of evaluations, as we're going to invest in them in capacity building. So my time as a partnership advisor, the assessments are going to be done like even with external and outsourced resources if necessary. We're going to coordinate between those partners. They're going to have priority in joint development of new ideas and projects. And the other partners will just go through the normal process, but without a very strong investment in their capacity building. Capacity building on project elements, yes, but not on organizational development. And that distinction really helped just for the planning of the available resources that we had. And partners were actually quite happy with that because they had a clearer idea of what to expect. Because you were a priority partner, so this is what you could expect, and this is what we would be accountable for. While you're a non-priority partner, you can expect a little bit less. So there were, you know, there were no feelings of like difficulties or challenges or like we feel inferior. We just focused our attention and our resources, and we gave partners the possibility. The non-priority partners were not excluded as such, but they could grow into priority partners, and there would be strict measurement of how the relationship and the involvement and engagement of the priority partners were. And they could fall out, they could come back in, but there were very clear 3-year cycles that need to be completed. And after each 3 years, this could be revised. And some partners could graduate and others could come in depending on the resources that we had.
Rob, I've seen that you've got your hand up. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, please. Can everyone hear me? Is that clear?
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Yeah, apologies, I missed the very start of the categorising conversations. Apologies if some of this is a repeat. I think a number of points rise out for me. I think in terms of is categorisation useful, I would say yes, insofar as it serves to support analysis of the partnership, and this is what Louisa has been doing through our internal training with our country colleagues, as you already heard described, is to support a common understanding of how to analyse partnerships and where to place those. So that's been really useful. Would we implement, you know, a multi-dimensional categorisation system and record it through our systems? I would suggest probably not. But that doesn't mean we're not looking at those categories, those divisions as part of our ongoing analysis. Another point within that, I think, you know, do you define by agreement? I would say no, because the agreement ultimately is, you know, the documentation, the agreement form you choose is simply driven by the type of partnership you want, and indeed can evolve over time or change over time as well. So simply categorising by types of agreement, I don't think is helpful. That should be the ultimate output of all the work you do beforehand. I think, I mean, there's the way we would look at things, I think, in terms of almost the continuum of a partnership is how, you know, across those different things you've identified within your categories is actually how many of those feature within a single partnership. So how multifaceted or multidimensional is a partnership, and I guess we would argue that the more of those you have, potentially the more strategic or the more mature that partnership is. But I think ultimately, and I think you've probably discussed this already, to me the really key thing in all of this is simply where where you are sitting in relation to power with that partner. Because if I look at this from both a supporting partner and an implementing partner, to slightly categorise people approach, I think the that power situation is absolutely ultimately what defines the nature of the partnership. If we as we're not Oxfam, we're a medium-sized NGO or even a relatively small NGO, relative to many of our partners here, we are very small fry indeed, and that obviously dictates the relationship in a very different way to perhaps when we're funding a small in-country NGO or delivery partner. I think the final point I want to make, which, and this is just a personal thing on my behind, is ultimately the strength of a partnership, or the value of a partnership is partnerships ultimately are based on the relationships of the people that initially set them up. Like all of these things, and to me the challenge is, can a partnership survive the departure of one or both of those, or those parties involved in setting a relationship up? Because if it is, that is probably the healthiest measure of a partnership there is. So I'll stop there because I've thrown lots of different things out.
Yeah, just very quickly, we've got about 35 minutes left, so if we perhaps sort of use the next 10 minutes to finish off the presentation, and then move on to that final bit and give people a bit of time to think about anything and share any final thoughts.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. Well, I think there was very rich discussion on different elements, so we don't have to go through all the slides, but I just wanted to highlight the three elements that might how to call that, just the stuff that I still had in mind to discuss with you, and then maybe you can just reflect on that. So I'll take the three slides in one, and then we can just see where the conversation would like to go. So one of the questions that I would like to ask is about the internal system based on the categorizations. Do we then, those that have categories, to what extent does it actually inform our systems, and do you have different approaches? And Lucy was already mentioning it, different levels of due diligence, monitoring of the partnership and of the activities, different types of contracts that we might have, different capacity development activities that you might consider for each of the different levels of partners and things like that. And then this is linked to the question that Lucy, or to the point that Lucy made as well. So how does this affect your partnership management and your business model? How many resources do you need to do this effectively and efficiently? Do categorization help in planning better how we work with others and partners, and what is then the kind of skill sets that we're looking for? So we could have a look at that. And then on the next slide, I was going to have a look at what do partners think, and that's Jane who already made that question. How are we going to sell this to partners? How do they experience this? And I just wondered if anybody had conversations with partners on this, if they are consulted, what do they feel, what category they see themselves under, and do they apply categories as well for the different kinds of relationships they have with us? Would WaterAid be a strategic partner for one, and Oxfam just a supporting partner, for example, and they might have different ideas on that as well. And if that, having those categories actually makes your relationship with partners and stakeholders different. And then the last slide was about donors, and that's about the systems that we have. If we have then strategic partnerships, and this is how we identify them and define them, and we have certain systems where due diligence is less strict for certain partners than for others, if that then is compliant to donor requirements, and if anybody has any experience or challenges on that. Another issue on this is if you then have a very well elaborated partnership vision with categorization, does that help in like selling your vision to donors, and the requirements that they make for partnership management, because they are setting us up to build local civil society organizations, to really work on empowering relationship. That's what they kind of expect. But at the same time, they have very stringent requirements on how we use their funding, which often doesn't combine very well with that vision of partnership that we have, and maybe like categorization or a very clear definition and a very clear strategy might help in having that discussion with donors. So those are the three elements that are still on the table, and we've discussed a little bit in general, but I want the conversation to go where you guys want it to go. So I'll stop here and let you pick up on certain elements that have already been said, or one of these three, and then we can close it up and have a bit of a final reflection.
Great. Does anyone want to share anything on any of those three areas, as it were? The internal systems, partner perspective, and accommodating donors within that whole framework?
Hi, this is Lucy. I think in terms of partner perspectives, no, very aware that this has been done quickly, and that there hasn't been time for much consultation with staff internally, let alone with partners. So I think it will be a case of having something in place and then going and I guess road testing it with partners to see what their feedback is and if it works for them too. And with donors, then again, we haven't looked in detail. I think I've got a new colleague who's just started recently who's looking at due diligence from a DFID perspective. So we had a really good conversation today, and I think absolutely a shared understanding that these systems and processes need to support the partnerships, and decisions around funding will then influence partnerships too. So I think it's a very important link to make to the link with donors, and I'd say it's work in progress internally, but we haven't got to the end of that question yet.
Anyone else? Yo, I wonder if you wanted to say anything. I know you wanted to take a bit of time to catch up.
Thank you. Yes, I apologise again for missing what sounds like a really good first hour. And I don't know where the conversations went, so it's a bit tricky. I suppose what I wanted to say was, one of the reasons I think we want to do this is because we want to make the lives of those working on new partnerships and some established partnerships at a program level easier. We want them to feel more confident in the types of partnerships they think they ought to be getting into. We're being quite demanding of our staff. We want you to program differently. We want you to think about change at scale. We don't want you to be using the same old partners to do delivery-based programs. We're all about change and change at scale, and that's making life really hard because we're challenging our field staff to come up with totally new concepts of how work gets done in totally new types of relationships. And what I had wanted was to come up with something that's made them feel a little bit more confident about the road they were setting off down, and then helping them to become more competent at it if necessary. And what I had thought was, if we were able to define and agree, get 4 or 5 different types of relationship that we have with people that we know will get the job done under different circumstances, then we can start working to that, so that we can start then supporting people with the right documentation, the right sort of contracts, the right sort of guidance, the right sort of learning. And it's proving really difficult because I think, as Jan will have gone through, there are so many different criteria on which one could base a categorization system. And we sort of started off down the road of, what ended up to be sort of who we were in partnership with. So, it would be a relationship with a university, or a relationship with a UN body, or a relationship with local government. But that doesn't get to the crux of the matter of what is the nature of the relationship that you are having and what is our role in that. So that didn't seem very satisfactory. I think there's something around, we've been exploring a little bit around the nature of whether goods change hands, whether goods or services change hands, whether this is just an alliance where nothing changes hands, but we work together with our own resources to achieve a goal, and then maybe disband afterwards. So we've really struggled, to be honest, which is why it's brilliant that Jan has been able to pull this together and benefit from hearing all your conversations, and why I'm quite so cross with myself for not. But I suppose that's one to say for now. I've got some stuff to reflect. I know we're going to have some space for reflection, Lucy, so I don't want to do my reflecting now, because it is stuff I've picked up just from listening to the last half hour or so. But I'm happy to answer any questions, or just be quiet and wait for the next chance to speak, whatever is most appropriate.
Thanks, Yo. I saw we had a couple of other people join us on the call. Taya, I know you'd signed up to join and you didn't join right at the very beginning. Did you have any questions or observations from what you've heard?
Hi, similarly, I was in another meeting, so I missed the beginning part of the session. I think I'm senior manager of strategic programs here at Plan International, and at this stage I'm just in listening mode to try and understand what else is happening in the space around partnership. So it's been really interesting to hear thoughts from other colleagues.
I lost you.
Tay, you were very quiet, but I think that you didn't have anything more to say. Am I right? Right, okay, I think Taya was just, in listening mode as well, because she joined a bit late. Any other questions from anyone else, or observations on those last three areas that Jan mentioned before we move into sort of final reflections?
I've got a question. It's Yo.
Hi, Yo, go ahead.
And it might have been covered. So it was something that Jan and I have talked about in the past. Well, it's been exercising this occasion in the past about sometimes when we've got relationships or pieces of work that need to be done that are truly transactional. We are going to pay you some money to go and do this job. This job could be any number of things. And we do that quite a lot. We've done it a lot in the past. We continue to do it a bit. We try to steer it. Sometimes it's absolutely the right thing to do. But sometimes we also tip over into asking ourselves, but what is the nature of that piece of work or this relationship that says this is a partnership, as opposed to this is a piece of consultancy work, and should therefore be managed and handled and resourced slightly differently. And I wondered if that was something A, you'd already talked about, or B, was familiar for people. And for me, it begins to ask some really interesting questions about the nature of the partnerships we think we're in, and sort of just studying that a bit deeply, and then thinking, well, what does that mean for the sort of partnerships we really want to have?
That wasn't something that's come up explicitly, although it has been touched upon in various comments and stuff that Jan said. So I don't know, has anyone got any reflections on consultancies and how we categorize them, whether they're partnerships or not? Well, I know for us that we are trying to use fewer consultancies at CAFOD, and that's primarily for financial reasons. But also, one of the things that we've been looking at in our last strategic review was how we use the expertise of our partners more, and how we link them up between them for them to benefit from their expertise. So, for instance, rather than us providing, so this isn't kind of necessarily consultancies only, but more generally technical expertise, rather than us providing a sort of consultancy service to them with technical things like child protection or accountability or gender or whatever it might be. We're trying to get partners to use their expertise amongst themselves and vis-a-vis us, rather than paying for, usually northern-based consultancies to provide that kind of input. So I don't know, that doesn't probably answer your question completely, but that's where we're on, or where we're at with consultancies.
Well, that's also super interesting in that part of it, which might be a different conversation, but one of the roles that we've defined ourselves for the future is that of a knowledge broker, which really hopefully means us not being the holders of all the knowledge, but knowing how to connect people up and support people, partners, independent experts, sort of bringing them into contact with each other so exactly that type of thing can happen.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to do as well, rather than being sort of the holders of all the knowledge, as you say, and being that hub where they all have to come to. It's more about setting up those links. And we had a really interesting case actually recently where we had bishops from the Congo visit our program in Brazil, all about maintaining the equatorial forest belt. So there's a program in the Amazon primarily around advocacy on that, and we got our bishops in the DRC to go over to Brazil and visit and to hear about that. And that was a really interesting kind of piece of what do you call South-South learning.
And presumably cheaper than an international consultant.
Without the need of an international consultant, exactly.
Interesting. Well, probably another discussion, but a really useful, a really interesting one. Yeah.
Any other thoughts, comments on consultancies or donors, partner perspectives, systems? I know no one wants to talk about systems. I did ask my colleague here at CAFOD if she could join us, but unfortunately she wasn't able to. And she's been quite instrumental in kind of trying to take these conversations about things like categorizations and types of partnerships and transform those into a reality of systems that our program staff can use and that we can then use to monitor and evaluate our work. It's not always easy, but I think it is really helpful to have that technical perspective to bring us back down to earth as to how we actually just manage all of these things.
Hi, this is Lucy. I think, for me, the systems are really important, making sure that they're appropriate and easy to use. Again, it's work in progress, but we're developing a global meal framework at the moment. And one of the things we want to do is to incorporate how we monitor the health of our partnerships within that global meal framework. So that's something that we'll be working on this year.
That sounds quite interesting, Lucy. Perhaps a topic for the next call.
Yeah.
Maybe when it's a bit more developed, yep.
If we don't have any more questions, I mean, obviously if you have one, do say, but otherwise, I think we've got 15 minutes left or so. It would be helpful if we could just take a minute or two to reflect on everything we've heard from Jan, from Yo, and from all the participants, and then if you'd like to come back with any final thoughts. And as Yo was saying to me this morning when we were having a quick briefing call, that doesn't have to be related to the content of the presentation, but just to the topic more generally and your experience. So just take a minute or two, have a think about what we've talked about, and if there's any other burning thoughts you'd like to share or questions or any other observations you'd like to make, then that would be great.
I've got one final question for Oxfam, and apologies if I missed it already, but it would be really interesting to hear more about what's your timeline now going forward and kind of what's driving this interest now for Oxfam institutionally in this subject.
So I can probably do that off the top of my head. The timeline, what's driving it institutionally is rather what I said. We're asking people to work in new types of partnerships. We're suggesting all sorts of things that people might want. We're setting people up to go and find new ways of working with others to make our programs more effective. That's a massive ask of people. Most of our staff's comfort zone at a project level is to manage partners to deliver programs. And that's really not what we want to be doing in 5 years' time. We think what we want to be doing, and it's a big challenge, is to be almost the back office function for partners who are fully equipped to go out and run programs, do their own programs. And we can be the knowledge broker, we can be the convener, we can be clearly the donor sometimes, but not always, and the supporter of others to get the work done, work that fits within our overall vision of how things will change for the better in any given context. And that means working really, really differently. And what we're trying to do is set out a few, well, you know what we're trying to do. So we're just trying to set some definitions to make people's work easier. That's part of our Oxfam 2020 vision, which will stretch way beyond 2020 because we won't have hit it by then. And the timelines, just for this particular piece of work, which is an OGB piece of work that we will then offer up to our confederation to go further into it, is by the end of this year, so by March the 31st, I need to have a relatively decent draft that I have consulted on internally of an OGB vision of what's extra about Oxfam GB and its partnership, what's extra and special compared with the rest of the confederation, because we obviously have our overall partnership policy and principles, and these types of partnerships that we think we will then help to better equip field staff to know what they're doing, not that they don't know what they're doing, to help invest resources in the right way to get the best out of the work that our staff do. So that's by the end of March. I need to have a draft of that. And then I've got all of next year to work with somebody external to write all the underlying documentation for those types of partnerships, so different types of contracts that would involve. I think the basic documents that we already use, like, do we have a strategic fit with a given potential partner? What are the capacities that would need to be developed with a potential? All of those are similar, but some of the contracting stuff is going to be different. But what's more important is the underlying guidance of how you start and maintain and then end those relationships. And examples of that will all be available to people by the end of next year. Not every single type of partnership, we're not even going to try, because we could come up with 999 if we wanted to, trying to narrow it down to 3 or 4 or 5 that will be helpful for staff to move away from our fairly traditional model of us handing over money and the job getting done and somebody reporting back to us. So we want to move it from there.
Thanks, yeah, that's really interesting, and also, yeah, kind of interesting for me to hear the level of resource you're putting behind that internally to get all of those internal systems and processes to support that way of working as well. Is that, just out of curiosity, would that be a full-time person or would that be a consultancy?
I think it would be a consultancy at the moment, and I'm really, really unsure that in the current climate,
yeah,
we're going to get that. We're going to have any of that available. So this was the plan.
Yeah,
about
sure.
10 days ago.
Oh,
so,
okay.
So it's still an aspiration.
Yeah.
I don't know that we won't. There's clearly going to be a lot of money having to go into how we manage certain aspects of our partnership going forward.
Yeah.
If we can, if we can bend that to our advantage,
yeah,
then there's going to be loads of money.
Yeah. Thank you.
So it's a little uncertain. That was the plan. It's still the plan.
Yeah.
We might have to do it differently, but my initial thought had been have somebody as a consultant. I had originally asked for an extra member of staff, but I was never going to get that for a year or 2 years.
Yeah.
So it was a consultant. It was going to be 20 days in 3 months or something like that to get all that under the supporting documentation written and resourced, and then quite a period where we would be responsible for piloting and learning and piloting, and then something good enough to go at the end of next year.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. That's really helpful.
Does anybody else have similar ambitions? Sorry, I'm hijacking.
That's all right.
Anybody else got this on their agenda and needing to deliver?
Yes. Yes, but as also, yeah, capacity is the issue internally, because I'm part of a team of 2, but there's a vacancy at the moment, and we're going through a strategy revision process. So, kind of still to be confirmed whether the other person will be replaced or not. So, it's definitely it's work that's really needed and really important, and it's a question of internal priorities now. So it's really helpful to hear how other people are approaching it, and also the potential resource behind it.
Yes, I mean, potentially, I thought we would have got the external consultancy, I'm pretty sure. But we will see. We will see. And once we've done it, it's for everybody. You know, it might not suit everybody, but we're not going to be hiding it.
Great, thank you. So, does anyone have any final thoughts they would like to share? Or Jan, if once people have had a chance to speak back, maybe you would like to share your final thoughts on what you're going to do next, or how you'd like to take the conversation forward.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think Joel explained really well what our next steps are, and if there's interest to keep sharing and bouncing off ideas of each other, then we would be really happy to do so. I don't know if we want to do that in a like a separate kind of group or something like that, but there's definitely appetite from our side to share the draft, for instance. I imagine, just to now a little bit where the thoughts are coming from, like what we're planning to do. So it would be great to get some feedback on some of that. So yeah, we'd be happy with you to take this forward. I will share immediately my kind of takeaways from this conversation. I thought it was really interesting to hear the different perspectives. I prepared the slides and the problem statement, so I had thought about it a little bit. There were still a couple of elements that I found really, really interesting that I'm going to take away from this. And one of them is the aspect of language. Like we talk about categorization, but like the translation, how are other people going to interpret this in different contexts? And I thought that was really interesting, and that made me aware of, like, we have to be aware of, if we're going to use a categorization, to be clear about the limits of it, and to really make that very specific and very clear, and make sure that that comes across. And then second, linked to that, how is the importance of the culture? Like, how do staff feel this? Like how do they work with partnership? How do they feel the partnership? And how can we make that shift happen? How can we make them feel comfortable and take them out of that comfort zone now to look at it a little bit differently? And can we use these categorizations for that? Or are there other documents or other kind of activities that we need to plan, like training or just setting up webinars to just discuss this, rather than just sending out a document officially with these other 4 categories that we've come up with. Another very important element that I've taken away from is the notion of power. I hadn't really taken that into account. So the power in the relationship that really determines what that relationship is going to be like, and we have it in our definition, like being cognizant of the power relationships. But I think that like we just take that as a sentence. But I think thinking through that power dynamics will probably help us define that a little bit better. Another thing that, because I was talking about partnership and categorizations, and I was just pointing it straight to our country teams and the kind of partnerships that our country offices work with. But both WaterAid and the British Red Cross then also mentioned all their peers and the partners that they have here like that fund them, that support them, or that they just share information with. And I hadn't thought of that, but like, yes, like partnership as we are a confederation. So even just like if we talk about categories, we also have to look at, what partnerships do we have at a global level, in between us and externally, and how would that fit in, so that it doesn't just become like, okay, these are categories that fit like country team models. And I really like the part on the meal, so I really love to take the discussion with the British Red Cross forward on how to monitor partnerships, and the indicators, maybe the categories that we discussed in the beginning of like what kind of indicators could we like put next to them, so that we can actually follow up if we achieve that kind of partnership, yes and no, and how we can improve on it. So those were the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points that I really took out from this conversation. So thank you very much for that.
That's great, Jan. I'm really pleased to hear that you've found it helpful and that you've, had some other thoughts brought to your thinking. Is there anything else that anyone else would like to share? One final thought, or volunteer to, take this conversation forward with Jan and Jo?
This is Lucy. So yeah, really happy to stay in contact on this. I think it would be really interesting for us as well. Just one final question, which was whether you'd be able to connect with colleagues in the humanitarian team that are doing the remote partnership training at the moment, because it's launched about a week ago. So you may also have some colleagues that are also asking themselves many of the same questions, and it may just be helpful to bounce ideas with them as well if you haven't already.
Yeah, I will definitely do so. No, I didn't have a chance to do that because you mentioned this in our call as well 2 weeks ago, but then with all the events that happened, it got kind of pushed away. But I will definitely pick back up on that, because that's an important aspect of our new ways of partnering as well in conflict, in conflict and fragile states. We're now setting up internally a working group to think about that a little bit more, of like, what are the implications and what does this mean for our due diligence. So it probably is going to be, if it's not like one of the categories, it definitely is a piece of work that we're going to work on, how we're going to do that remote partnering, or like partnering in fragile states where we don't have always access to, and what does that mean for our system. So we're setting that up internally, and yeah, I'd be happy to share with you as well, what comes out of these conversations.
Yeah, that would be really interesting, because I think the remote partnership is definitely one aspect, and I think really pertinent to conflict and emergencies. I think the other aspect of the training, from the way it's been designed, is just really encouraging people to think about the questions we've been talking about today. So what is partnership? What's the transactional relationship? So I think the Partnership Broker Association is a really good resource if you're looking to try and build a level of common understanding amongst staff. And so I think there's likely to be people within Oxfam that are starting to get a different insight into what partnership means and doesn't mean.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're working very closely with PBA, both as OGB and Oxfam International. So they're very much involved in the discussions that we have in different regions, because we really like their model and their way of approaching partnership. And we're really using their trainings in regions and inviting country teams, to instill that kind of that way of thinking on partnership. And yeah, we find that very, very useful. So yeah, we're definitely working closely with the PBA on that.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Great. Well, unless anyone else wants to add anything, I think we've come to the end of this call, this event. So thank you to Jan for preparing that problem statement and sort of leading the discussion, and to Jo as well. Thank you to all of you who've been able to join us today. There will be a recording of this, of the conversation, and Ian from Oxfam's also been taking some notes. So when he's had a chance to put those into a more, put them together, we'll circulate those. I'll do that via the Bond platform, so just keep an eye out for emails from Bond, because that's how I try and communicate. It's a bit easier using that rather than pulling people's email addresses off. So I'll send that out hopefully in the next couple of weeks or so. But yes, thank you very much, everybody.
Oh, thanks, Jane. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you, Jane, for organising. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Yo.
No, Jane.
Bye, Ian.
Thanks all.
All right. Bye-bye.